Good. So these video notes are going to take you through patterns of evolution. What I mean by patterns of evolution is we know evolution is when we see populations changing over time. What we're going to look at here is what are the patterns of change that we notice and what names can we give to these different patterns. So before we get into that, a couple quick checks. We've gone through tenets or basic ideas of evolution by natural selection, and we've gone through evidence. So we're going to see how we're doing. So my first check, over time, ground squirrels have developed longer tails to balance in the trees. What type of evolution is this an example of? Good, so hopefully you were able to get that it's the environment of the squirrel, so the existence of these trees and them moving to live in them. And that is the environment changing, which makes it natural selection. It's the environment driving change. Next one, according to this fossil data, which type of life is older, fish or amphibians? So hopefully we remember that with fossils, the further down in the Earth's crust that you dig, the further back in time you are going. So according to this, we have mammals on the top being most recent, dinosaurs, amphibians are next, and fish. So fish would be older than amphibians. And then all the way down at the bottom, we have trilobites. So the four different types or four different patterns in evolution we're going to look at are called convergent evolution, divergent evolution, adaptive radiation, and coevolution. Now, converge and diverge were terms that were introduced on kind of our vocab preview, because if we can remember that converge means to come together and diverge means to split apart, we can understand a lot about what we should expect to see in the patterns of evolution for convergent and divergent evolution. So remember, as you go through this, make sure anything that is in red, this does have to go in your notes. So have your sheet out in front of you, make sure you're filling it in as you go. In convergent evolution, we have organisms that are not closely related, so not sharing a recent common ancestor, but they develop similar traits over time due to similar environments. So having similar pressures from the environment on them makes them more similar to each other. So my little shorthand for convergent evolution is I have two dots right here to represent two different ancestors, so two different histories. And those dots are kind of have arrows pointing towards each other to show that they're going to get more similar over time due to the fact that they're in a similar environment. Any structures that these organisms share are going to be analogous, meaning they will look similar in shape and have possibly the exact same function, but they will have very, very different structural characteristics due to the fact that they're not coming from that common ancestor. They're coming from two different evolutionary histories. A concrete example of this that we can point to, if we look right here at your vertebrates, vertebrates split to form they split so that we have our mammals over on this side, which is where we would also find humans, in addition to the puma and dolphins. And then you have your sharks over here. Now, this is where your vertebrates split. If we look up here, your dolphin and your shark are an example of convergent evolution, because when we look at their sort of structures, the fact that they have these streamlined bodies, these fins, these dorsal fins on the back flippers, all of that is basically evidence of the fact that they have evolved to be in an aquatic or water-based environment. If we were to look at this organism right here where they split or diverged, we would notice that this organism would not be living in the water, would not share these characteristics. So because these characteristics are popping up again later on in history, it's because of their evolutionary history. It's because of their environment, not because of that shared evolutionary history. This is very different from divergent evolution. In divergent evolution, organisms do share a recent common ancestor. But what happens is these two different populations over time are going to build up enough differences between them that they actually split to become two different species. And we call this process by which a population that was once one species, building up enough differences between them that they split, we call it speciation. So my little shorthand diagram here shows one purple circle to represent shared evolutionary history, shared common ancestry. And then I have two arrows coming off of it to show my populations diverging or splitting from one another. Now, these organisms will share homologous structures. So the prefix homo here should help us remember that it's the same. So the similarity or the sameness is because it's coming from the same common ancestor. Examples of homologous structures we talked about are things like the bones in the human arm and the bones in a bat wing. Same bone, same order, but human arms have evolved to grasp, whereas a bat wing is adapted to flying. We have those similar bones due to the fact that we had an ancestor a while ago with those bones in the same order. If we bring natural selection into this, we can really see the difference between convergent and divergent evolution. Evolution by natural selection tells us that divergent evolution would occur when a population splits and those two populations are exposed to very different environments. And those different environments we know are going to drive different adaptations, different traits that make you better at surviving there than other things. And so these different adaptations or different traits, over time they're going to accumulate until my two populations are so different from one another that we say that they have diverged, they've split from that common shared history. An example of this we can point to is our woolly mammoth and our modern elephants. A woolly mammoth lived in much colder climates, so they had long hair in order to deal with that temperature change, whereas modern elephants live in much warmer climates, so they've actually lost a lot of their hair. They have very minimal hair. So again, common ancestor, which is what they're shared, but different environments makes them split to form two different species. So quick check, convergent or divergent evolution. Bats and butterflies have both evolved to have wings, but do not share a recent common ancestor with wings. Good, so hopefully you get that's convergent. So this is a similarity we are seeing in structure due to the fact that both bats and butterflies fly. They both have that same environmental pressure, they can fly, but it is not because they have that one common ancestor. So again, we said bat and butterfly wings would be an example of analogous structures. So that's another thing we can look for to determine if something's convergent evolution. Next, we're going to look at a very specific type of divergent evolution. This is called adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is a type of divergent evolution where one founding population splits to become many different species. And this happens kind of rarely, and it requires specific circumstances. What happened with Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands is an example of adaptive radiation, and here's why. What happened was you had one founding population of ancestral seed-eating ground finches. So there they are at the center. This was one population. This population then got split up between lots and lots of different islands, and each of these different islands had their own food and they had their own native habitats. And so the birds, this initial population that was all the same, over time adapted based on the conditions of their specific island. So for example, birds that were eating mainly insects, they ended up with kind of these shorter and wider beaks up top here. Some of them developed very thin beaks for being able to pull insects out of there. You have seed eating, so depending on the size of the seeds, we get different sized beaks in our finches. We have our cactus seed eating, so again, distinctive beak to be able to deal with that. And we also have buds and fruits, so again, distinctive beak to deal with that. What we're seeing here is adaptive radiation because it's one population splitting to become lots and lots of species all at once. Type of divergent evolution, but specific because it's like a burst. One sort of core population forming many species all at once. The last type of evolution we're going to look at is called coevolution. This is when you have two different species that are so interconnected in their lives that they actually exert pressure on each other to evolve. A great example of this are any birds that feed on nectar and the actual flowers themselves. What we tend to find when we look at bird beak size and flower shape is that they apply pressure on each other. The birds need their beaks to be a certain size to get into the flower, and the flower need themselves to be a certain shape to make sure they're transferring the pollen onto the bird, because that's what they're using the bird for, as a pollinator in order to spread their seeds around. So what we find is that these organisms will drive changes in each other, and we can actually pick out what a bird's primary food source will be based on the shape of its beak. So here you have a bird that's perfectly evolved to eat this super curvy flower here, and then hummingbirds with their tiny, dainty little beaks, they're going to feed on very small flowers. And the flowers will have sort of specific up here. Here's your anthers to transfer pollen, so it's going to drop it right on the head of this bird. So the next plant that it goes to, it'll do the same thing, put its beak in, and it'll transfer its pollen. So again, super interconnected relationships drives changes in each other, and that's coevolution. The prefix co means together, so this literally translates to mean organisms that evolve together.